How hard did the virus hit U.S. transit ridership in March? Stay tuned for this month's National Transit Database Review on Strait Data Podcast Transportation. All right. Welcome back to the Strait Data world. We have March transit ridership and service data to dissect. But first, make sure you're subscribed to this channel to keep up with the latest podcasts on business, sports, and more. Click the card at the top of the screen if you want more material just related to transportation data analysis and news. And guys, follow me on Twitter @StraitData to stay up to date on video releases and other info. I retweet random stuff, so it's pretty helpful. Click the like button if you enjoyed the vid, please, and stay tuned for the comment question later in the video. So that's going to be coming up. So keep your ears out and make sure you drop that comment down below. And so I think it was last week that we got March data from National Transit Database. And I'm a little bit slow now with some other vids that I've been doing, but wanted to just go over the numbers. And it's a pretty curious time because we want to know how is COVID-19 impacting the transit world and the public transportation sector. And going into March, I covered this last month at some point, but going into March, we were looking at February data. It looked like we were already seeing the impacts of COVID-19 on transit ridership. I think it was, let me see the numbers. It was down 5%. February was down 5% from January. And it was something like that. It was something like a 5% decline from the previous year, despite January being like up 1% or 2% year over year from the January before. So we had just cracked in the first month of 2020. We had just cracked the 12-month rolling average positive territory, and that rolled in. That was rolling in at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. But then even the 12-month rolling average looked okay in February, but we could tell February was dropping. In March, we got the new data, and we knew that March was going to be really bad. I mean, that's when all the closings really started to take effect, full effect across all the states. And you had just tons of people working from home. I mean, everyone who could work from home started working from home. So in your really big cities like New York that control a lot of the ridership, the ridership was, they control ridership for the whole country. You know, New York has like 40 to 45% of the nation's transit ridership right there in that metro area. But, you know, everyone who was able to work from home just wouldn't hit the subway. They wouldn't be going to the big the high rises and the office buildings. If they didn't have to. Now, the subways in New York, I believe, never closed. I mean, they always stayed open. Transit around the country really stayed open. And we'll get into how much the service changed. It did drop. The ridership obviously fell. So let's get into those numbers right away here. I want to get into the overall ridership number nationwide, U.S. transit ridership. It was down 45% in March 2020 from March 2019. So just the current month, year over year, was 45% lower. And it was down 40% just from the previous month, just from February, which already was down from the month before, as I said. So the decline it was going on 50%, which is just ridiculous. I mean, that's a huge drop. We kind of expected that large of a drop. In fact, I really didn't have a good idea of where that number would be. I mean, was half was certainly in my scope of thought. I thought half of transit ridership. My worst fears were that it would be worse than that, but it's still a mind-boggling number to look at the ridership number and go, it's down 45%. It's just down 45% from the previous year. And the 12-month rolling average, that brings the 12-month rolling average that was just 2 months ago, it was up 1% year over year. It's now down to minus 2.5%. So just in 1 month, we basically erased all the progress that we had through 2019, especially at the end of 2019, where we had a surge in in the ridership. We really had troughed in transit ridership, and we were headed back up. But this has obviously unraveled that. And I talked about that on my last video. I said how it was obvious that, we were all of our gains were about to be erased. And I mentioned that because I had predicted that we would trough and that we would actually start increasing, because I could see the trend coming for a good 6-9 months. I really saw it creeping up, and I thought, okay, we're about to hit the bottom here. And I said, if we didn't have January, all my whole prediction that we were going to go positive finally after years and years of declines in ridership, that prediction was going to be all for naught, but we had January, and so we did poke out into the positive territory, but now it's been all wiped out. Minus 2.5% 12-month rolling average. So 1 month brought the whole 12-month rolling average crashing down, and the 12-month rolling average, by the way, the 12-month rolling average was below 800 million, which, typically it hovers well above 800 million. I would say somewhere around 850. I mean, you're talking about annual ridership numbers that are on the order of 9.5 to 10 billion. So, if you take a 12th of that, yeah, you're somewhere around 800 to 850. But it's been a long time since our 12-month rolling average dropped below 800 million. I think you have to go back to 2014 or something like that for that to find that numbers like that. So, or rather, not 2014, way before 2014. We're talking about when the ridership was really low. 2014 was the peak. So, yeah, we're gonna have to go back more than a decade, I think, to get numbers like that. So, all that to be said, service, transit service, vehicle revenue miles deployed and vehicle revenue hours was also down. It was not steady. And I talked a little bit about politically how challenging it is to cut service, even when you have an emergency like this, where operating transit and having people in transit, it's not a great idea. But when you have poor people, you have low-income people, and some of them are necessary workers, grocery store workers, things of that nature, where you don't want to keep people from being able to go to work, especially if they're essential. And it's just really politically challenging to shut down transit service. You also have the employment of all the bus operators, and you've got unions that control it, and they're going to be, I'm sure to some extent the unions will say, no, we don't want to work because we don't want to put our people at risk. But to another extent, the unions might say, well, you can't just cut service. We have an agreement. You agreed to pay us to operate and to give us these jobs. I mean, if you cut service, then we're all out of a paycheck. So it's a really fine line. And the service was down 23% from March 2019. So ridership down 45%, but service down 23%. So it makes sense. You don't have as many buses and rail cars out there operating. And it's a chicken and the egg. You never know how much the service deployed was matching the drop in demand, the drop in ridership, or some agency said, hey, we're going to close up shop because it's not smart to be operating transit here, or we're going to cut back service to some extent just to avoid some of our closest contact routes or whatever it may be. Some agencies may have said, hey, we're going to add service. I mean, we need to add buses in these routes and increase the frequency so that people are more spaced out on the buses. We can't have tons of people crammed on the buses, but at the same token, the demand really didn't call for that. I heard that anecdotally. I mean, hey, we need to have space between passengers, so we need to add a ton more buses in the system so that no one feels like they have to get onto a crowded bus. There will be another one coming shortly, sort of an idea, but there aren't people waiting for the buses. I mean, even in your busiest times, in your peak hours, on your peak routes, I don't think you had the people, unless a rare circumstance, So maybe some cases agencies wanted to add service, but for the most part, when the ridership cuts down 45% or 40% month to month, then it doesn't make sense to be operating as many buses like I said, to a certain extent. And every region is different. Every agency is different. We all know that. But we're talking about March data, remember here. So we're a little bit in the past. You have to think in the past a little bit when things were really starting to close down. And there was a lot of fear going around that may not exist today because we have a little bit more information. We know what the curves look like now. But in March, we were looking at these curves going skyrocketing, and people really were scared of where this could lead in sort of a psychological sense. So the service 12-month rolling average is down 1%. So while the ridership 12-month rolling average is down 2.5% from previous year, the 12-month rolling average for vehicle revenue miles is down 1% from the previous year. So there's a little, and a lot of that has to do with this current month, the disparity between the drop in ridership and the drop in service. That resulted in a boarding per revenue mile decrease of 28% from March 2019. And hey, that makes sense. That's part of the game. I mean, if you don't want to cut service when you know demand is going to drop like a rock, you only drop it a little bit, and ridership goes. I'm sorry, when you don't want to cut service, but you know ridership is going to drop, then you get boarding per revenue miles slaughter. And what you would think is, okay, we know that ridership's going to cut, but the service is going to get cut as well. Well, the service didn't get cut as much because of these political challenges of taking away all transit, even if demand is way lower. And I'm not going to say whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I mean, obviously, this is an extreme circumstance. I don't personally look at the 28% number and go, oh, this is horrible for transit. I mean, transit is doing what the people, what the agencies, what the decision makers think that transit needs to do. Now, I talked last time about the implications of transit in a pandemic. I mean, who wants to get onto a subway or even a bus for that matter and sit in a seat that someone else sat in, touch a rail that someone else touched, be, real close to other people? That's the whole nature of transit. You're trying to squish people onto a vehicle. That's the whole efficiency of it. That's why people advocate for transit over to solve congestion problems. I mean, if we can get people out of cars, we can get them into one big bus, get tons of people. They would take up a lot of space in a car, but if we get them out, saving space is a huge part of transit, and cramming people together is a huge part of transit in urban areas. And so the whole notion of transit operating during a pandemic, we all know we're going through something very strange here. And so for those users who need it to just get around, to get from point A to point B to their job or to the grocery store, these decision makers feel like they need to keep transit rolling. And so your boardings per revenue mile is going to drop. That's really the efficiency measure. The number of passengers we're carrying per service cost that we're rolling out. So my comment question of the video is, what do you guys think about that? I mean, what do you think about this whole decision of continuing to roll vehicles out there? I mean, should we have cut service by even more? Service went down 23%, ridership cut 45%. I mean, should the service have reacted a little bit harsher? And what do you think going forward? Do you think in April, when we get the April numbers, the agencies will have caught on a little bit and said, well, ridership's even lower than we were putting out service for. We cut service, but ridership dropped even lower. So are we going to drop our service even more? And do you think that there's going to be a tighter relationship? Do you think that the boardings per revenue mile decrease is going to be not as sharp? That's my comment question for the day. But also, not just what do you think, but what do you think is going to happen in April? But what do you think about the agencies, decision-making wise? Do you think the agencies should target matching the service provided to the demand change? Or do you think that the agencies should just provide smart service and just keep in mind the folks that need it absolutely? And what do you think? Because it costs a lot of money. You're paying drivers. I mean, across the country, you're paying drivers to drive empty buses. You're paying cleaners to clean these buses. I mean, for every bus you operate, you have to hire additional people now that you didn't have to hire before to clean that bus at the end of every route and the end of every day. I mean, I've heard anecdotes about tons of more cost going into cleaning supplies and cleaning labor. So what do you guys think about that? Do you think the agencies should take the pedal off the metal even more, or take their foot off the pedal even more? Now, let me go over some other metrics that we can get from the data here. Operating speed on transit, and these are some pretty interesting things. Operating speed on transit was down 2% in March 2020 from March 2019. So the bus vehicles slowed down despite the ridership getting cut by 45%. So they're carrying half the passengers, but they're going slower. And typically, when I looked at the 45% number, I immediately thought, well, at least the buses will have sped up, and so we're carrying people a lot more efficiently. Maybe transit looks even, more competitive. Well, no, that's not the real case, because the reason that buses are, even though buses may be going faster because they don't have to pick up as many people, vehicle traffic is also faster because there's not as much traffic on the road. It's the same principle. But yeah, I thought with 45%, I mean, it would be so powerful as far as we don't have to stop so much, we don't have to load so many passengers on. The buses would be zooming. I mean, they would increase in speed, but it seems like because there is also some administrative, the bus driver may need to explain to passengers what the rules are. There may be different protocols. You have to wear a mask, and so the bus driver has to stop and turn people away, and there's just more deliberation. Maybe the bus driver has to tell the passengers to follow certain rules that he wouldn't have to take the time to do before. I'm guessing that sort of confusion that we're all figuring this. Maybe there's some new protocols on boarding and whatnot, but also they have to stick to the schedule. Even if they were able to zoom a lot faster than they were before, they kind of have to stop and wait. So that will lag their speed. That will take away the gains that they would have had. And then any new cost as far as time cost, as far as boarding passengers who are confused or scared or new rules, that would contribute to slower operating speed. And that's what we got. 2% is a huge drop for a 1 month period. So vehicles operating at maximum service was down 15%. That kind of matches the service numbers. I mean, if you're not putting out as much service, then you're either cutting frequency or you're cutting number of, well, if you're cutting frequency, then you're cutting vehicles operating at maximum service, basically. Even if you're cutting routes, same thing. That's just buses that you have stuck in the garage that you're not operating. So the VOMS was down, but only 15%. So that's from down 15% from March 2019. The bus ridership was down 44%, by the way, compared to rail being down 47%. So rail was hit harder than bus, despite bus being on this trend of falling faster than rail in ridership, or bus ridership losing share to rail over time. That's been a long-term trend going back, decades. Bus has been really, really getting crushed, especially in recent years, compared to rail. I mean, rail's been carrying more people as a share of total. In fact, rail is now carrying more people than bus as a total, and that change only happened about a year or two ago. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where rail was finally then carrying more passengers across the U.S. than bus. Passenger trips, rather, or boardings. But just because of this pandemic, bus ridership was not hit quite as hard as rail. They were pretty close. But as I kind of would expect that rail, people don't want to get into rail as much as bus. I mean, rail is tighter. Rail is, you have to stand closer to people. You have to touch rails, and there's just more people in a rail system. But in a bus system, there's a little bit, typically buses operate in less dense areas. There's a little bit more space in a bus typically. Now, in your most dense and your most packed peak hours, yeah, the buses could get full in a lot of places. But in general, I thought that buses would be people be a little less scared, and more users that require the service to get around use bus. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, lower income people, but people who work from home, they tend to be higher income people. They use rail to get to work sometimes in some of these big metro areas. They hop on the rail, commuter rail, heavy rail to get to the high rise, and they walk from the rail station to their office building. That would be high income people. Those jobs tend to be jobs where you can stay home and work. But there's a little bit of a disparity in type of user from bus to rail. So Ferry was down 58%. By the way, even though bus was only down 44%, bus rapid transit was down 54%. So I don't know if that's because BRTs were more crowded typically before, or maybe same premise that I just mentioned. Higher income people, people that could have worked from home, were the ones that were using BRT more than just what NTD codes as normal buses or city buses or metro buses, whatever. Commuter rail was down only 35% though. So that kind of flies in the face of what I just said. I mean, why was commuter rail? This is another comment. Let's make this comment question number 2. If you're still listening, comment this down below. Why was commuter rail down only 35%, whereas rail in general was down? That would be heavy rail like subways and light rail included in rail total was down 47. Commuter rail was only down 35. And I thought commuter rail would be people that could work from home more, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I thought light rail, heavy rail, you could get some low income people shifting around, jumping around, hopping around the city. But commuter rail is people who live out in the suburbs, who have these jobs, incomes is to buy houses out in the yonder, and they come in and they work. They're going to be working from home. Or what is there missing here? I mean, I would not expect commuter rail to be down less than rail total. So someone comment that down below and tell me why. It's just really confusing to me, but it's also really interesting. And we'll see these numbers if that trend continues in next month. But that's basically all the metrics I wanted to go over. I didn't want to drill down too far. We all knew that this was going to be happening. This is the beginning of the massacre in transit ridership. But I think we will come out, of this. I think April is going to be the worst month. That seems pretty clear at this point. I think the April numbers are going to look even worse. I think April is going to be a decline of greater than 50% compared to April 2019. It could be around 60% if I had to put my finger on it. May will also be bad. It will be very bad. But I think May will be worse than March compared to previous year. But I think that May will be better than April. I think that there's a lot of people that are starting to go back to work at the tail end of May. Maybe midway through May, people really starting to go back to work. Some states are reopening some aspects. So I think that, it's going to be March was bad. April's going to be horrible. And then May is going to be probably worse than March, but better than April. But this impact is not going to go away after May. I mean, this whole calendar year, 2020, transit ridership, I said this in the last video, we are going to be able to look back at the transit ridership trends and get a clear image of what happened with COVID-19 just looking at the transit numbers. It's going to be so evident. It's going to be so catastrophic looking. But yeah, my prediction for April ridership, for instance, is I think we're going to get under 350 million for the month of April. We were at 330 million in March. I'm sorry. That's wrong. Let me get the right number. We were we were about 450 million in March. I think April is going to be under 350 million. And I think for 2020, it's really hard to tell. I mean, how quickly are we going to come back? I don't think any month for the rest of 2020 is going to have as high ridership as 2019. I think it's all going to be negative from here on out comparatively. But how low is it going to be? I mean, I'm guessing through the summer we might get to a point where we're only 5% below the previous year, kind of like in February. But then I actually expect towards the end of the year, towards the winter months, as either fears or the reality of a rebirth in the curve, or the virus starts spreading again and creates like a new issue, a new curve in the population. I suspect that transit ridership will fall even more, will basically fall again. So it's dropped, it's going to come back a little bit, and it's going to hover. It might get pretty good towards the end of the summer, and I think towards the fall and the winter months, towards the end of 2020, it's going to drop again. Hard to tell if it'll drop as severely as it did here in April. I'm thinking that April's going to be the worst month, but yeah, I'm putting my finger on 7.5 billion. That's my prediction for the calendar year 2020. So hopefully we can look back, and I'll tweet it out and say, here's my prediction for April, 350 million or lower. And my 2020 calendar year prediction as of right now on May 20th, 2020, looking at the March release of the NTD data, I'm guessing 7.5 billion for 2020 ridership, which all things considered is not seemingly the end of the world, but it's pretty low. I mean, like I said, we're talking about calendar year ridership typically around 9 billion, 9.5 billion, even 10 billion in recent years. So 7.5 is my prediction at this point. Comment what you think about those predictions. What do you guys think about April being under 350? Remember, April last year, by the way, was 850 million transit boardings. So 350 million would be a huge, huge drop. We're talking like 60 to 70% decline from previous year. And what do you think about my 7.5 billion target for annual transit ridership in 2020? Well, that's all I wanted to cover this week. Remember to comment your comment question response down below. I had a few questions. Do you think transit service should match the demand level? And what are your views on that? Why was commuter rail ridership only down 35% versus rail total being down 47%? Why were all these people using commuter rail still in March? And what are your predictions for April 2020 ridership? And what are your predictions for 2020 annual ridership? And what do you think about my predictions? So click that like button if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'll catch you guys next time. Until then, peace.